Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I would like to join Sherry in welcoming you to our question and answer program. So I am ready, Sherry, if you have questions.
Wonderful. Well, we sure do, Stan. We have questions coming in already. So let's go to the first one today from an anonymous viewer. And it goes like this. I had my first 2 holotropic breathwork sessions last week. In both sessions, I felt tingling all over my body and then a desire to shake and move my body to release energy. This happened towards the beginning, and after that, I carried on breathing, but nothing else happened, at least as far as I was aware. I didn't feel that I entered any kind of trance, although maybe I'm misunderstanding what that means, and I didn't feel that the experience moved me forward in any way. Could you comment on this? Is it common to have sessions where nothing of what we've talked about in the course happens? Is it worth carrying on and trying again when the first 2 sessions were like this? Thanks so much.
Okay, well, it's actually quite exceptional that nothing would happen. And what you are describing, the tingling and then a tendency to move, you should accept the invitation. People usually have an idea what kind of experience they should have. They should see something or the memory is coming and so on. This process takes you where you need to go. So if you have a lot of tension in your body, for example, what Wilhelm Reich called the body armor, then this is what's going to happen. It's going to build up the tension and it's going to be discharged in shaking and in movement. And you simply have to allow the energy to carry you in any direction it wants to go. Any movement, any faces, any shaking, any movements with your body, with your legs, hands, even if it doesn't make any sense, just really follow this spontaneous healing movement happen. And then when that energy is discharged, then something else would come up. But it's important not to have an idea what you would like to have, where you would like to go. But then the other thing that we look at, some people are very much in their head, a lot of thinking. So usually as part of the introduction to the breathwork, we say, bring yourself into the present moment. Let go of any plans, any programs that you have for the session. Try to be in the session with what the Zen Buddhists call the beginner's mind, as if you knew nothing about this process, allowing yourself to be surprised by what's coming and allowing it to happen if something wants to express itself. Now, if it's the situation that really keeps you in your head and thinking, then we sometimes suggest use a mantra as you're breathing. You can repeat. You don't have to do it loud. You can do it in your mind. We are ourselves used to an ancient mantra which is called Hamsa. In Sanskrit, this means Brahman, and also it means a swan. Swan is the symbol of Brahman. So when you are repeating it, Hamsa, Hamsa, Ham, you are basically saying swan, swan, swan. But then after a while it becomes Saham, Saham, Saham. It kind of changes the sequence. And so you are saying both Hamsa and Saham. Saham means I am that. So basically you are in Sanskrit saying I am Brahma, I am that. And if you keep yourself busy with that mantra, you just breathe and say with the mantra, that really interferes with any kind of mental processes that would get in the way. The other thing is sometimes in the process you can come up with some specific reasons why you don't go into the experience. Some people, for example, have the feeling they need to be in control, and they have ideas about what would happen if they lose control. And even in everyday life, they really have that sense how important it is to be in charge, in control. So that can be big obstacle for some people. And of course, allowing yourself to let go, to lose control in a situation where you're supported, it's a tremendous relief. And then once you do that, you are in control, but not because you are able to hold all that material down, but because what you had to control is not there anymore. Sometimes there could be some other things that people don't want to do. And I remember situations where people would say, the last thing in the world I would like to do is to throw up. And then, of course, there's a reason for why they feel that reluctance, because there is that disposition, and then they would have to allow themselves to do what they really don't want to do. So if I were you, I would sort of continue, give it a couple more chances, and see if there's anything specific that you can identify as being in the way. Rick and I talked about astrology, archetypal astrology, in that one of those bonuses. So this also has some astrological correlations. People who have very strong Saturn, for example. Saturn represents the resistance. So that could be also one reason why it's more difficult for you to get into that process. So be good to have a consultation with a good astrologer. I think I recommended Matthew Stelzner, mstelzner@aol.com, who can do it by Skype, so we can do it anywhere in the world with him. And consult him to say that you have difficulties, and if he sees anything in the chart, but that means then there could be times in the future where what we call transits would be more sort of benevolent, more conducive to opening up. So those are about the associations I would have. I would not give up. But it is true that there are people for whom it is especially difficult to let go. I've met people who have tried in psychedelic sessions and all kinds of workshops and always had the difficulty. So then you have to go through all those things that I mentioned, and also consult the astrologer, see what he or she can tell you.
Okay, thank you. And Diego is here with us. Diego, I'm just opening your line now. Go ahead with your question.
Oh, hello, Sam. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yeah. Is there a systematic approach for death psychotherapy using holotropic states of consciousness? And if so, could you briefly describe it?
What the psychotherapy using holotropic states would look like?
Yes. Is there a systematic approach, a structure for it, or?
Well, this what I call holotropic states of consciousness is that there's a whole range. For example, I would see psychedelic experiences as being holotropic states of consciousness. States induced by shamanic techniques, states induced by different breathing techniques, and also some of the spontaneous episodes when you work with people where this triggered by some process that we don't know, basically spontaneous episodes. I'm going to try to describe what would be the common denominator, when you want to work with these states, depending on the category. So the one important thing is that the holotropic state of consciousness functions as a kind of a radar. It finds the places where you have to go, material in your unconscious where there's very strong emotional charge. And also, if you are in that state, the things will start happening, like we heard about, tendency to make some movements, let your body shake, a tendency to make some sounds and so on. So the important thing is to trust that there is a self-healing intelligence operating, and whoever's working with you has to have respect and support whatever is spontaneously emerging. So that's one important thing. The other one, if you work with these holotropic states, you have to vastly expand your cartography of the psyche. You cannot use this very superficial map, which is being used in mainstream psychology and psychiatry, map which is limited to postnatal biography, only what happened to you in infancy, childhood, later in life, and then the Freudian individual unconscious. You have to expand it. You have to add the what I call perinatal domain, which is the record of different stages of birth. And then there's a vast area which we now call transpersonal, where you can have experiences of identifying with other people, identifying with members of some other species. You can have experiences that take you to the past, into history, sometimes with the sense of remembering, which makes it a past life experience, past life memory, if you want. You can also have experiences from what Jung calls the archetypal domain of the collective unconscious. For example, some mythological images, mythological beings, or visiting some mythological realms. Jung himself had many, many spontaneous experiences, and he documented it in a really amazing kind of a monograph, which he hand wrote, the manuscript, illuminated manuscript called the Red Book. So there you see, to how many different areas this can take you, and you cannot use the map that's currently used in psychology, psychiatry, because many of those experiences that have to do with psychospiritual death, rebirth, or past life experiences, or archetypal experiences would be seen as pathological, not recognizing that as the image of what psyche is like under normal circumstances. So this is very important. You come into it with a large map of the psyche. It's much more like what you find in the great Eastern spiritual philosophies, in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, and so on. Then you have to have trust in the self-healing potential of the psyche. And of course, you have to have a sense that spirituality is a legitimate dimension in our psyche and in the universal scheme of things, which again you don't find in current psychology, psychiatry, which is very materialistic. So there is quite a problematic attitude towards spiritual experiences and religious experiences. So these are the common principles that you would use in any of those forms of holotropic states, holotropic therapies. And then, of course, each of them would have some specific additions. Like certainly when you work with psychedelics, there will be some additional things that you have to consider and pay attention to. I wrote a book which is called LSD Psychotherapy, that specifically discusses the holotropic states induced by psychedelics. Then my late wife and Christina, we wrote a book on holotropic breathwork together. So there you would find the specifics of the work with the states induced by breathing. And then we wrote some books on the spontaneous episodes, which we call spiritual emergencies. Those books are The Stormy Search for the Self, and then also one that's called specifically Spiritual Emergency. So if you are interested in any of those forms, those would be the texts where you would find more specific information.
Yeah, LSD Psychotherapy is my favorite book on the subject. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Stan, let's go to our next question, and thank you, Diego, for coming on live. So the next question, and Stan, we spoke of this just prior to the call. An anonymous caller asks, I wonder if you can speak about the role of entheogens for those who have experienced spiritual emergency. I know it's generally not advised for people who have a history of psychosis to use entheogens, but I have also heard where entheogens can help in healing psychosis. And if there's not a true psychosis, but rather psychotic-like symptoms that are part of a spiritual emergency, then how does one make that determination?
Okay, I will have to divide this into two different areas. One I will tell you my sort of theoretical perspective, and which is of course different what we can do practically, because we need certain kinds of arrangement, special setting to do the kind of work that I will be describing. So just from a theoretical point of view, even in traditional handbooks of psychiatry, you will find out that the episodes, called psychotic episodes, that are very dramatic, very acute, with a lot of rich symptomatology and intense emotions, those actually have the best prognosis. And you will find some in traditional psychiatry, in the handbooks, you will find reports that some people who had this very powerful episode of a psychotic break, if you want to call it that way, they actually felt better after the episode, as if something got resolved. And you specifically find that these good prognostic signs are when you have the experience of psychospiritual death and rebirth, or destruction of the world and recreation of the world. Those were seen as good prognostic signs. And on the other hand, the states which develop very slowly, and they are what's called oligosymptomatic, they have just a few symptoms, it's not very rich, very dynamic, those are most difficult to treat, those are more difficult to handle. And yet, the general strategy in psychiatry is to slow down things, to suppress things, to mitigate the symptoms rather than activating the symptoms and using the healing potential of that process. So in Prague, I have actually worked with several patients who would be called psychotic in traditional psychiatry, using LSD or psilocybin to get them through that. And with good success. You will find a couple of those case histories in my book, When the Impossible Happens. So this is just in general about what would be called psychosis, even in traditional psychiatry, psychology. Now, we have sorted out a certain really large category of these episodes, which are currently seen as psychotic, but we believe that they are actually movement of the psyche to self-healing, where the symptoms are actually indicative of a healing movement in the psyche. And we started calling them spiritual emergency. If you sort of work with people in those states, you encourage them to experience what is coming up, and maybe even use body work to help the emotions and the pent-up energies to emerge, then they would be healing, they would be transformative. I even believe that it would be evolutionary. So we have in this Psychonaut course, we have one specific module on the problem of psychosis versus spiritual emergency. So again, if it's what we talk about as spiritual emergency, you would basically encourage people. You would create special situation in which people would be encouraged to go and express whatever emotions are coming, express whatever the body wants to do. And in that kind of situation, it would make a lot of sense to, if the process, you want to accelerate it further, if you would use entheogens. Okay, so this is theoretical. Now the practical part of it is that you cannot do it on an outpatient basis. You cannot trust that if you start doing this kind of a process, that you can contain it in 2 hours. And we don't have special facilities where people could go and not to get tranquilizers and be supported in this process, let alone get psychedelics to further intensify it. So this would require special facilities. You know, remember, it would require staff of people who share the same philosophy and feel comfortable and capable to support these states. So this would be the condition, and ultimately it's the problem of what we call paradigm. The current paradigm in psychiatry and psychology is you suppress symptoms, you find ways of stopping symptoms. When I was studying psychiatry, we still had basically 2 categories of approaches. One category was called uncovering approaches, and then covering. So uncovering would, when you do something that you can actually get to the core, you can get to the reason why people have symptoms. And the covering is just give people something that mitigates the symptoms, that they cannot sleep, you give them hypnotics. If they are too active, you give them tranquilizers. If they are too inhibited, you give them some kind of a stimulant and so on, and for depression, antidepressants and so on. None of these will, of course, change anything. It is basically keeping the symptoms under control, but not really finding out where it comes from, and certainly not doing something that would deal with it in a very radical way. We would say causal way, causal versus symptomatic. So that's the best I can answer. I mean, the current paradigm does not support the kind of approach that I would feel is preferable. You would have to have special facilities for that. You would have to have specially trained people who would be supporting the person in this kind of process. Ultimately, it has to do with a radical revision of psychiatry. We have to expand that very narrow cartography that we have of the psyche and include the perinatal, include the transpersonal. We would have to bring in the understanding of the healing, self-healing potential. We would also have to accept spirituality as a legitimate force in the human psyche and the universal scheme of things, rather than something that has to do with lack of education, you know, not knowing enough about what materialistic science discovered about the world, seeing anything spiritual as superstition, magical, primitive thinking, and so on, that should be replaced by rationality. So this would be a major changes that would be required for the academic community to embrace something like work with psychedelics, and also to change that approach to these spontaneous episodes and see them as a self-healing movement rather than a pathological process that has to be stopped.
Thank you, Stan. We have Shanti Lily with us. Shanti Lily, your microphone is open. Go ahead, welcome.
Hi Stan. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Oh, good. I can see you too.
I have to look a little sideways, but I can see you. Yeah.
I know. I got to move my eyes sideways too. But anyway, happy Ruby Tuesday. And I have a question. I have to be concise. It's about 2 different things. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Okay, it's about the same subject of what you would call and what I'm calling now a spiritual emergency. But at the technical level, it was a bipolar break, a severe complete psychotic break, but we're calling it a spiritual emergency. And the two things I wanted to ask you about, one is that I had this superhuman strength that I've never had before, that I was able to do all these acrobatics and flips and gymnastics in the backyard and climb things that were unclimbable and jump from things that were unjumpable. And I just had all this strength to do all these things. And the other thing was there was a 40-pound rock that I felt was in the wrong place, spiritually. It didn't make any sense. But anyway, I picked it up and carried it a far way. And the next day, people said, what happened to that rock? And I said, I carried it over there. And said, they said, how did you carry a 40-pound rock? Okay, so there's all these physical strength things happening I've never had before in my life. And then there was also, I had premonitions. And unfortunately, the only two I can think of are that I knew Obama was going to be president. There was no question. I knew he was going to be president. I also knew that the Army was working on little cameras, because I've read about it now, that are cameras that are within birds and insects that they use for what do you call it? When you're watching over people, then what they use for, what is the word for it? Surveillance. That I've read now that they do have these little things they put in birds and insects for surveillance, and they say they're not using it yet. Yes, see, you've heard of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I knew that was going to start happening. I thought it was already. So that's all. I just had powers in my mind and body that I just don't have now. And I wondered if you get that a lot with people who are in a, really spiritual emergency. I wonder how common that is.
Well, this to the activation of the physical strength. This happens quite frequently. And it also happens to athletes. For example, Michael Murphy, the co-founder of Esalen, wrote a book with Ria White, which is called The Psychic Side of Sports, where this kind of capacity is activated in the middle of some kind of a major feat, athletic feat. Like as a case of somebody who ran and won marathon and then continued running 3 hours at the same speed, very sort of excited in ecstasy, or very strange things that can happen. For example, you might come to the ocean. I've heard it from people who have taken MDMA or MDA, coming to the ocean, and they can sort of swim for hours, and it seems almost like they're like a submarine. There's no fatigue coming. Also, our body can exert, much more strength than we can mobilize in our ordinary state of consciousness. For example, if you see an epileptic seizure or epileptic seizure induced by electroshock, I mean, the force of the muscles was way beyond anything that you can do with those muscles in everyday life. In the initial work with electroshocks, bones were broken, by the strength of the epileptic seizure induced by electricity. Also, when we see kind of a demonic energy that's coming in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, then the strengths that these people have. We sometimes need like 4 people, to work with it, to control that. This is way beyond anything that they can do in everyday life. So it can, a non-ordinary state can mobilize these kinds of capacities. For me, it worked in a yet different way. I certainly don't have a body for yoga, pretty heavy set and so on. But in my psychedelic session, I was able to do things in yoga that I wouldn't dream about doing in my ordinary state of consciousness. The flexibility that became available was quite amazing. So body can do that. And I would recommend Michael Murphy's book, not just The Psychic Side of Sport, but he also has a book which is called Future of the Body, where he's collected, and his team, they collected observations from different cultures, from different centuries, of all the things that happened with human body in non-ordinary states of consciousness, talking about the CDs, the mind over matter phenomena in India, the yogis and so on. So this is very, very common. I'd like to go back to your spiritual emergency. What made it spiritual emergency? So certainly if you had psychic, you felt that your intuition, psychic abilities were increased. It would be something that would be part of a spiritual emergency. Was there anything else?
Someone in my life.
Beyond the physical capacity that you are describing.
Right. Well, there was someone in my life who was basically driving me crazy, but I'm sorry, the spiritual emergency went in stages. The first stage was I fell in love with someone who there was no chance of being with. So what did I do? I did something I've never done before in my life. I went to bars. Now, I went to bars for 2 months, and I flirted with all kinds of younger guys. I was having my midlife crisis, but what it really was, not just a midlife crisis, it was on the way to having a spiritual emergency. So I had a lot of fun at the bars, but then I flipped my lid. And so I had to stay home. So I stayed home. I had 2 family members at home. So there was food, and I could exist at my home, and I was there for 2 months. You want to know what else caused it? Was that your question?
No. What would make it spiritual emergency? What you described was what they described as the manic state. When you're going to bars and sort of acting out and so on. Right.
I didn't have sex with any of the people at the bar, so it wasn't like that. It was more of just a flirtation, very high energy, a lot of mojo, a lot of hypomania, but that wasn't the crazy. Then at that point, after all those bars and all that flirting and all that craziness, then I did go to the other side, where I was in complete delusions. So
what were the delusions about?
Well, part of it was what I had mentioned before, that on the television, which I had on all the time, and I was having a conversation out loud like we are now with the television for weeks. And I thought that there were Scientologists working on the other side of the television, using the e-meter on me, and taking the charge out of every single trauma I'd had in my entire life. That's what I thought was happening with these Scientologists on the television. But what happened was I believed it so strongly that it did heal everything. I mean, then it healed my whole body, and it healed my mind of all sorts of things. So that's, a lot of the form it took. I did a lot of singing, a lot of dancing. talking to the television constantly. And I kept saying to the TV, hey, look, you guys out there, if you're there listening to me, then you're as crazy as I am, because you're talking to the darn TV too. And I would say that about 10 times a day, just to remind them, if there were real humans back there, that, you know, they weren't any crazier than I was, because they were watching me on TV.
Okay. You know, a lot of the things that you describe would be typical for the manic episode, the tendency to socialize, you know, to get involved in interaction with people and making jokes or telling jokes and so on. Now, this some of the things that you're describing with the television. I think the problem is that if you are in that state, you should have somebody working with you, and you keep that experience inside. You see, so that you know where it is really coming from, what you are dealing with. If you are interacting a lot with the environment, then you get a mixture of what's happening out there and what is happening inside, and you cannot easily sort it out. And so I think if you had been in a situation where somebody would be working with you, you would find out where the distortion of the perception of the television and so on was coming from. So that is one, you know, basic principle for working with people in spiritual emergency. You want to create situations where people go inside, when they don't mix it with their everyday life, because that's where they get into trouble. And also it's at the expense of all the insights that you could get when you are really keeping that process as inner. But again, you would have to have supportive people who have some experience with this and can help you. So I think we'll have to leave it there. You know, if you look at the book Stormy Search, we have about 10 types of what typically happens in this what we call spiritual emergency, and you would find out which of them are really significant part of your experience. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Yes, Shanti Lily, thank you for coming on live. And our next question is from Anne Lu. And Anne asks, do you have any experience with iboga? Has anyone done any research on this subject, and how is it different from other psychedelics?
Well, I have had ibogaine myself. I had experiences with it, but I have not had a chance to work with it clinically. But there have been experiments, like in Florida, for example, or in Europe, also in Holland and so on, using it for drug addiction quite successfully. Now, in terms of the content of the experience, it's interesting, very much like ayahuasca can bring some elements of the Amazonian jungle, like visions of jaguars, and the anaconda is a very, very common vision. In the ibogaine experiences, you can have frequently African elements. And what seems to be quite specific for iboga is as a journey back to ancestors and to the beginning, including the beginning of the world and so on. Those kinds of things can happen. But I don't have the the extensive clinical experience that I had with psilocybin or mescaline or MDA and so on.
Okay, thank you again, Stan. And our next question comes from Casper, and Casper asks, in the past, I have had several strong experiences through ayahuasca ceremonies, dancing, and meditation, where my body starts shaking and twitching violently. I have a concern about awakening Kundalini energy and not being in a safe space with a person of enough knowledge to guide me. Can you talk a bit about the dangers of Kundalini and what can a person do to prepare? Are there any common particular signs in the early stage of Kundalini? And if so, can one choose to stop the experience? Hope you could shine some light on this, and I look forward to meeting you in Sweden for the upcoming holotropic breathwork workshop.
Well, this, this is something that can happen, but doesn't have to happen. You can have frequently in holotropic states, you can have experiences that involve the chakras, or involve what's called the nadis, which is the subtle energy channels, particularly the three major ones, which is the Sushumna, the central one, and then the male and female, the Ida and the Pingala, that are represented usually as, the staff of Asclepius, kind of winding, and in places where they cross the chakras. So you can have experiences of these nadis, activation, opening of chakras, and so on, without this being actually a process of activation of Kundalini that would be going on for a long period of time, including months or years. So there are some other factors that would lead to this actually becoming a process where the episodes continue, and they can come in the middle of everyday life. People who are lucky, that happens when they create a situation for that, when they sit down for meditation, but it can happen also in the middle of everyday life, when it really creates a disturbance, and then it's one of the types of spiritual emergency that we talked about. Now, we had a lot of connection with Swami Muktananda, who was the head of the Siddha Yoga movement. He was a Siddha, and he had the capacity of awakening this Kundalini process, and it's called Shaktipat, with touch or look. He had a wand of peacock feathers scented with sandal oil, and was hitting people over the head, and people started having Kundalini experiences. And again, in many, many instances, this was manageable. They could just do it when they were ready to meditate, or when they came to what was called the intensive. There was, intense meditation, and so on. His own position, for what it is worth, was that the Kundalini comes into your life when you have a 50-50 balance between good karma and bad karma. And he didn't actually see himself as somebody who has the potential to awaken the Kundalini under any circumstances. That he believed that people come to find a Kundalini yogi at the time when they are karmically ready to start having those experiences. So if you are like in practicing in Kundalini yoga, then the idea is you have to really prepare yourself for it. You have to both physically prepared and emotionally, psychologically prepared. They talk about this Kundalini. If you are not prepared, it can be like allowing a strong electric current, into a weak electric bulb. So if again, it would be general lifestyle that you would have to have in terms of the nourishment and exercises and so on, if you would like to be prepared for the Kundalini awakening when it would happen to you. But it's also important to know that the holotropic state itself is not necessarily conducive to create the Kundalini awakening, which is a process, an ongoing process, but it can create experiences of the chakras and the nadis. And in the Indian literature, this would be called pranic experiences, experiences of certain aspects of the Kundalini process, but not the awakening where the energy tends to have a certain task and continues doing it until it does its job, which is clearing of traumas, but also spiritual opening. And then when it is happening, the major warning is not to fight it, not to try to stop it in any way, but really cooperate with it, create situations where you can really do whatever the energy wants to do, anything that has to do with body movement, anything that has to do with visions, anything that has to do with waves of emotions and so on, which are called kriyas. Pranic experiences in holotropic states are not the same as Kundalini awakening. That is much more rare for it to happen after psychedelic sessions or some other powerful experiential exercises.
Okay, thank you. And next we have Jeff with us. Jeff, your line is open. Go ahead.
Hello, hi, thank
Hi.
you. Hello, Stan, good to see
Hi.
you, as always. So I'm at a stage of, I'm certified now in the breathwork, and I've started running my own holotropic workshops here in Ireland. And I did my first one in November and my next one's in May, and it's going really well, it's really exciting. And so at the moment, I'm trying to kind of upgrade my understanding of the physiology of breathing. So I have a little bit of a technical question, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So, in the training I've studied about, what happens when you breathe, and I would just like to clarify, I suppose straight from the source, what actually happens. I understand that when you breathe in more oxygen, you reduce CO2, which makes your blood more alkaline. But then I think I heard you say one time that some way, paradoxically, does that reduce in less oxygen going to the brain when breathing? I'm just a little bit unclear as to the whole physiology around the breathing. And I'd love to hear a little bit more on that. And one kind of associated sub-question is, in the workshop I did, one of the participants was really kind of holding their breath for a very long time. And it kind of tested all of my facilitator skills, because I was kind of like, God, I wish they'd take a breath. It was nearly like going for 3 minutes, And I was like, I'm sure they're fine, trust their inner healer. But I was just curious as to, have you seen people hold their breath for very long periods of time? And at what point would you intervene in a situation like that? Or would you?
Okay, well, you have a few questions there in one.
Yeah.
The physiology of breathing is very, very complicated, and to really know what's happening, you would require a good laboratory, because there are all kinds of factors involved. For example, the pace of the breathing, the depth of the breathing. Then there's something called the dead space, where the exchange of gases doesn't happen. You see, that not all the gas is exchanged. There's a certain what's called dead space, and that can be different, and that would really influence the whole situation. What happens physiologically. So generally, we have a mechanism that makes hemoglobin, the pigment in blood, absorb more oxygen in an acidic environment. That's a mechanism. When you are doing physical exercise and you're doing sports, you create what's called metabolites, chemical substances, which are basically acidic. So it makes the blood more acidic. And that makes the transport of oxygen more effective, okay? Then counteracted by the fast breathing, because then you exhale carbon dioxide, which is acidic, and you create the blood more alkaline. But it again would depends on how active the person is in the breath work. Some people are very, very active. Some people just breathe, but they don't move. So that would also change the what's called the pH, the acidity alkalinity ratio. Okay. Then you have also what's called homeostatic principles in the organism. So if you have blood which is more alkaline, the kidney would be responding to it and be more alkaline. Urine would be excreted. So they're trying to compensate for it. So we have another mechanism. And then there are certain areas in which this breathing can cause vasoconstriction. And in my experience, that depends on your history. When you have these tensions in different parts of the body, let's say the muscular tensions and so on, you compress the arteries, okay? So very frequently you see, like in the hands, people who cannot get the hands warm.
Mm-hmm.
And they typically have what has been called as tetany. When they breathe, they get a lot of tension in the hands. And if they continue to breathe, it builds up, and then there's a release. And you release the tension, the muscular tension, and you get better circulation.
Mm-hmm.
So then it depends on where you have this disposition to constriction, because then the breathing could be intensifying those constrictions. So that could become the reason why there could be less oxygen coming into the brain. I think if you take all these factors into consideration, you would probably get a situation which was very close to being in a high altitude. I believe there is a parallel between the reaction to the holotropic breathwork and how you would respond to a stay in high mountains. It's called elevation sickness. People can have, headache and other problem, nausea even, and so on. Very much something that can happen in the breathwork. But on the other hand, there are people who just get ecstatic in high mountains, particularly people who have already done a lot of the clearing work. If they've been, practicing the breath work and so on, there is a tendency to actually have a very positive reaction in the higher altitude. So I know this is not a simple, answer to this question. We need some laboratory studies, and this would require, of course, a lot of funds, because it would mean to have access to a laboratory, both for doing the electrophysiological and other examinations, and then also sending the chemical samples to a laboratory for analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the studies, I don't know if you have anybody who speaks Russian. Actually, some of these studies were done in Russia, not always by people who were trained as holotropic breathwork facilitators, but they became interested if they read or heard about the response, the psychological response to breathing, that they wanted to test it. And there was a situation in Russia where everything was owned by the government, and it took a while before it got privatized and so on. So there were people who had a laboratory, and they would bring a mattress there and let people breathe and do these studies. They became much more interesting and important if you see the psychological impact of breathing. So before it was seen just as physiological studies. Now it's this is a psychophysiology now. So hopefully it will be done. But again, in the United States specifically, this will be quite expensive.
Mm.
Oh, you mentioned the long apnea.
Yeah, if possible.
Now, this is known that when you breathe fast for a long period of time, you just exhale the carbon dioxide, and then you can stay without breathing for a long time. This is what they do in Ceylon, for example, the pearl fishers. They go down for pearls, and they can stay, 5-6 minutes underwater without any problems. And you find in handbooks of respiratory physiology that it takes about 8 minutes before you start having any kind of negative influence on the brain.
Uh-huh.
So that's one of the things, is that you just simply don't need to breathe very, very much after you have breathed, intensely for a number of minutes. And the other thing, sometimes this holding breath is really related to birth, when it basically replicates the situation where you were not getting the oxygen. And that
Uh-huh.
can be a very, very powerful kind of a opening of that, and catching the breath afterwards. So
Yeah.
that could actually be mimicking something, repeating something that is part of your history that you're working on.
Mm-hmm.
Not just a simply physiological situation.
Mm. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And the best of luck. Is it this weekend you're doing the Psychedelic Science Conference in Oregon? It sounds amazing. And I know you're doing a breathwork workshop there, which is totally sold out. I wish I was there. I'm sure it's going to be great. Best of
We're starting the breathwork tomorrow morning, actually, in Oakland. It's a big conference organized by MEPS, the organization that Rick Dublin is running, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
It's going to be a good weekend.
There will be another interesting conference in the last week in September. This will be in Prague, the International Transversal Conference. There's going to be a lot of the new psychedelic researchers present there.
Okay, thank you, Stan, and thank you, Jeff, so much. Thank you for coming on live.
Yeah.
And our next question is from Sierra. Sierra asks, can you shine some light and wisdom on narcissistic personality disorder? I've found myself involved in relationships or friendships with narcissists, and by the time I realize why they are the way they are, I've already become very connected to them.
Well, I think the very significant element in it is very poor self-esteem, very poor self-image, although you would not tell it from the behavior of the people, because it usually seems to be showing the opposite on the surface, but it's frequently covering a lot of insecurity of the person, low self-image, and that would have of course, a family history, and could have even deeper roots, which would be, perinatal or transpersonal. But I think that pathological need for recognition and sort of an important place in the world. Sometimes it's mistaken for strengths. There's a powerful personality. But if somebody is a powerful personality, they don't have to advertise it. They don't have to, show off to the world. So it's one of those situations that Alfred Adler was describing, where the overcompensation of a feeling of insecurity, inferiority, and so on, by going to the opposite. That can be so strong that, of course, it's done at the expense of all kinds of other people. It's like a me, pushing your way in the world, and you're the most important thing around, where deep within you feel exactly the opposite.
Okay, thank you, Stan, for your response.
Wonder why you're asking that question.
I think for her, it was that she continues to find herself repeating that pattern in relationships.
Yeah. But I was asking sort of in a larger context too.
Okay. Okay, so our next question is from Maeve. I think it's Maeve. And Maeve asks, Lacanian psychoanalysis proposes the existence of a psychotic structuring of the unconscious. Could this be used as a method to identify persons who are prone to psychedelically induced spiritual emergencies?
Well, you would find personalities that would be more prone to break down. You would probably find very, very difficult history that could start in the womb, in the prenatal state, where you are sort of conceived in a womb which is not hospitable, which is toxic, which is maybe to a mother who for whom the pregnancy is a nuisance, and who really is not welcoming or inviting the fetus. We have seen many people who when they go back and they regress back, they actually felt that the womb was not hospitable. And then from that kind of situation, the person can go into a very difficult birth and have then very poor mothering. So if somebody has a history where they had challenges and difficulties, from the very beginning, then they could be prone to the breakdown. But the breakdown could be potentially a breakthrough. When I was talking about John Perry, who was a Jungian psychiatrist who had these two centers for spiritual emergency, Diabasis in San Francisco and then Chrysalis near San Diego, he actually saw it reversed. He believed that the real problem is the impoverished personality as a result of difficult life history, and then what we call psychotic break is really a very major kind of a movement towards healing, when you're sort of correcting somehow all the problems that happened as a result of the difficult history. So again, if we had a different way of approaching these things, then actually some of these very, very intense, acute reactions could be actually ultimately beneficial if they are treated differently. Because when you see intense emotions, whether it's anger, aggression, depression, anxiety, they're coming from somewhere. It's not just some kind of pathological process generating it. This is emerging from history. This is from situations that people had as part of their personal history. So this, when you see all these emotions emerging, it is at least potentially a cleansing process if it's not stopped, if it's supported, and if you work with it. But again, like in the earlier question, you would have to have special circumstances, because in the present situation, the recommended approach is for these states is hospitalization combined with some intense medication that is stopping the process, that you don't see the positive potential in at least significant part of these states. Okay, can we continue?
Yes, we can go to the next question. So Dane asks, can you speak about the potential of lucid dreaming for exploring holotropic states? Also related, since attending a holotropic breathing workshop in January, I have been feeling as if I am entering a holotropic state whenever I sleep, and sometimes come awake suddenly out of these states. Have you ever encountered this before?
There's definitely a close relationship between what's happening in holotropic states and what's happening in dreams. It's coming from the same matrix, from the unconscious. So we see frequently that, for example, dreams in the night before holotropic breathwork anticipate what would happen in the breathwork. And on the other hand, something that came up in the breathwork is the content of the dreams in the following nights. So there's a possibility that the dreams, the vivid dreams, are trying to complete something that was encountered in the breathwork. So we always ask people to, when they are involved in breathwork or any form of holotropic states of consciousness, psychedelics and so on, pay great attention to their dreams, because the dreams can really illuminate much from the process that in a very florid, very intense way you would encounter in the holotropic states induced by breathing or by psychedelics. Now, the lucid dreaming is extremely interesting. It's for those of you who haven't heard about it, the man at Stanford called Stephen LaBerge developed that, and had actually developed a certain machine that can help you to go through lucid dreaming. And there are ways. He wrote a book about it. There are ways where you can learn to lucid dream, to bring the awareness into the dreams. He did actually experiments where people were able to signal that they were lucid dreaming. They were aware of it, and you could compare it with the physiological record and so on. The most interesting thing was, I think, to use it as a way of supporting your spiritual journey, where the idea was, if you learn to work with lucid dreaming, that in some sense you can actually apply it to your everyday life. When according to the great spiritual philosophies of the East, our everyday life is really like a dream from which we can awaken. So you can use that, according to the literature, you can use the capacity of identifying the lucid dreaming in your everyday life, when you would somehow see through the dreamlike quality of existence in general, the everyday existence. So it certainly is a very, very interesting method, and it resembles some of the methods that were used in Tibet when you work with dreaming.
All right. Our next question comes from an anonymous viewer. Do you think that the psyche is timeless? Is it beyond time, and that's why we can re-experience past traumas?
Well, I really believe that consciousness is timeless. I just had the great pleasure and privilege to spend some time with Amit Goswami, who's a professor emeritus from the University of Oregon, the quantum physicist who now is applying the insights of quantum physics to a variety of areas. And his basic thesis is that consciousness is the ground of being. Consciousness cannot be explained from anything, and certainly not from the brain as a product of the brain. And he has support from quantum physics for that, where actually, matter exists, material objects exist in a state of probability, and for them to become actuality, they require observation, they require consciousness. So creation would require consciousness. Consciousness would be something that we cannot further reduce to anything else. It's like existence itself, it's a given. So existence, consciousness, those are the constants. Now, when you talk about the psyche, then you would probably think more in terms of the individual psyche, but I think about it more the way Carl Gustav Jung was thinking about it. The psyche itself is cosmic. He talked about the psyche as anima mundi, the soul of the world, of the universe. So there's a cosmic matrix, fabric, and our individual psyche is like teased out of that continuum, and the boundaries are not absolute. In these holotropic states, we can expand and we can start experiencing much more of the cosmic input than we are able to experience in everyday life. So, I believe that obviously our what we call our individual psyche is limited, is closely connected to our body, but beyond that, the consciousness itself, I believe, is timeless. Again, I will find out when I get there, but I have certainly a strong sense that death does not end consciousness. I have at many states where I had the feeling that I was beyond death, and I was surprised when I came back then to the environment where I did certain kind of experiment. And we have a lot of interesting material from thanatology and some showing that consciousness can exist outside of the brain. There are case stories where people not only cardiac arrest, flat EKG or ECG, but also flat electroencephalogram. There was that the heart was dead and the brain was dead, and yet as they were being resuscitated, they had certain kind of experiences observing the environment and so on that they could report about. In other words, there was consciousness that was functioning at the time when the brain was not functioning at all. So we have quite a few interesting observations supporting the possibility that there will be consciousness after death, and that consciousness is the fundamental attribute of existence. In the same way we cannot explain existence, why anything exists at all, we cannot explain consciousness, why there is consciousness. All those different dimensions from the archetypal world to the material existence.
Our next question comes from Leon, and Leon asks, is the Phi, or Akashic Cosmic Memory Field, a separate field in the collective unconscious? What is the distinction between them?
Well, I just wrote a preface to Erwin Laszlo's book, which I really recommend, which is called What is Reality? When he talks about a realm which is beyond space-time. And consciousness originates, and consciousness and matter have kind of a joint origin beyond space-time. And if you have that kind of understanding, you can get insight why it is possible that I would have a psychedelic session or holotropic state of some other provenience, and I can suddenly find myself in ancient Egypt, or can find myself in Renaissance France, or samurai Japan, and so on. How I can, in these holotropic states, have the experience of becoming an eagle, of becoming a lion, or becoming a mythological being, and so on. I think his approach is the most articulate that I know. He's a system theorist who really knows many different scientific disciplines. Also gets help of his two sons in writing, who sort of helping me to collect the material. And then the idea is that the critical aspects of existence are really coming from beyond space-time. And I mentioned Amit Goswami. He has a very, very similar kind of understanding of it coming from quantum physics. Years ago, David Bohm, who was again quantum relativistic physicist, he wrote handbooks on both theories of relativity and quantum physics. And he had that concept. I think I mentioned it in one of the earlier modules when we talked about holograms, that he had the idea that to account for the paradoxes of quantum physics, we have to somehow see the world that we live in, the material world, as being having a holographic quality, being holograms, and that the existence of these holograms requires a generating matrix. And he talked about this everyday world that we live in as the unfolded order or explicate order, and the generating matrix would be in the enfolded or the implicate order, which would be a dimension that we cannot experience, that would be in beyond the reach of our senses, but we could get in touch with it in our non-ordinary states. So that was already the explicate implicate order, but it was not quite clear in his writing whether the implicate order would be still somehow part of space-time. Whereas in the writings of Ervin Laszlo and also Amit Goswami, this is the matrix is clearly beyond space-time. And many of the things that we cannot explain in terms of horizontal causality, beginning with synchronicity, where our psyche seems to be interacting with the material world, they can be explained in terms of the connection going through this, beyond space-time. For example, the archetypes influencing our psyche, and also elements in the external world. So I would really recommend Ervin Laszlo last book, What is Reality? And several of the books by Amit Goswami, where he also talks about this.
Okay, and Stan, our next question comes from Angie. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
Okay. So Angie asks, I'd like to hear more information about the updates with the Spiritual Emergence Network. Last Q&A, you mentioned that there was a new funding source and that it might be reignited. I'm interested in how I might be able to get involved again. Also, I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at the Holotropic Breathwork Workshop and then the Psychedelic Science Conference. I'm watching today's Q&A from the plane on the way to SFO.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the question. It's an important question. As I mentioned, the SCN had very complicated history for several years, thanks to Dick Price. It was hosted by Esalen. We had a special house. Then it went to Santa Cruz for a while, then to the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, and then to CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, when we actually had a building and a computer and hotlines and so on. And then when the funds were cut during the economic crisis, cut to the school, then this was the most dispensable program. So it stopped existing. And for a while, Ted Esther, one of the people involved in Spiritual Emergence Network, was actually volunteering for free and was, kept the consultations going. And now there is the funds available, so he would be the person to connect with and ask, how you could get involved. So his name is Ted Esser, E-S-S-E-R, and the address would be California Institute of Integral Studies. It would reach him through that. So I think it's 1453 Mission Street in San Francisco.
That's quite a memory, Stan. Our next question comes from Bonnie. Bonnie says, I'm in the process of designing a cultural paradigm to support consciousness work and self-actualization within local as well as global communities, and would like to formulate a new kind of cultural center that provides resources for consciousness exploration in a safe and educational environment. I am specifically interested in bringing to the forefront the pillars of research with Tantra, shamanism, and psychonautics. Can you advise on whether there are any such places whose model would be wise to emulate? Do you have any advice or warnings for someone who is seeking to do this?
No, I don't. We tried for years to create a center. I can send you the suggestions that we had for the center, what that kind of center would involve. I will be happy to send it to Marco, and I think he will find ways of getting it to you if you leave your name and address with Sherry. And you can look at it. Unfortunately, we didn't get the money together. This would require some, significant funds. But there is now a possibility. There's a group of people who have the means and have the interest, who now are really trying to recreate that, revive that whole process, project. And so hopefully sometime in the future, we will have it. The full project would be a center where people could be in residence for a while, something like the SLN Institute would have also like an auditorium, would have a place where you can do breath work or some other forms of experiential work, spiritual work, and so on. That could have something like holographic laboratory. It certainly would have to have a library. We have, I have enormous number of videotapes, audio tapes from over 30 workshops at SLN and so on. It could be, very, very rich library, video library, and also library of books and DVDs and so on that people could use when they come. People could come for a day and do something like breath work or some other program. People could come from Australia or South America, the way it's happening at SLN, and stay for a few weeks. There would be breath work available. There would be yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, and so on. I'd be happy to send you the outline for it. You can sort of adjust it. You probably would want to pare it down a little because it's a very ambitious project. But I don't really know about any already existing center that would have something similar. Because there are centers like SLN, where you can go and have workshops, but not a center that would be specializing in some of the things that you're mentioning. So are you interested in leaving your name, and we can get the email? I'll be happy to send you that outline of that center, the way we foresaw it.
Yes, and Stan, I just messaged Bonnie to get in touch with Marco and that you would send the information through Marco.
Okay. It's a great idea. I hope we will have it, you know. So
Yes, wouldn't that be amazing?
we had very ambitious one. We wanted to have a couple of the Lily tank, the sensory deprivation tank, where people could have a certain time, you know, in a sensory deprivation tank, which can induce powerful experiences. Would be some very interesting ways of using biofeedback, you know, alpha feedback, theta feedback, and so on. So there could be a whole laboratory of consciousness, and would try different ways of work for you, and hopefully sometimes in the future that kind of center would also be able to offer, you know, psychedelic sessions. When we were working with LSD and other substances at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, we were asked from the National Institute of Mental Health, since we were working with psychedelics, you know, what we would suggest, how to deal with the wide abuse of psychedelics by the young generation particularly. And they didn't like our answer. Our answer was to create a network of centers where people who want to do it anyway would have the chance to go and have it with pure substances and under guidance, and where we could actually collect the material so that we learn about these states and about consciousness. It would change the situation where now, you know, teenagers know more about psychedelics than professionals, because professionals don't have a chance to work with them. And people who want to have psychedelic experiences, they always will find ways of getting it somewhere on the street. Not always in the ideal circumstances. Pure substances, and also not necessarily doing it in a way that would increase the benefits and reduce the risks. So that would be, you know, certainly for psychedelics, this would be very, very great project. It would generate, you know, a lot of important, interesting information from psychology, psychiatry, and so on. But what you're talking about is expanding it, and you know, including tantra and other things. Tantra, as I mentioned also in one of the earlier modules, that's actually a model of something that we would like to have in the future, which is a discipline that combines the work with non-ordinary state, the spiritual, and also science, the synthesis of the best of science and of spirituality, the way it was in Tantra. Tantra had very, very advanced science, besides being also a psycho-spiritual system. So where are we, Sherry?
We are very much at closing time. I wonder, are you up for one more question before we close, or? Okay, all right. So our final question is, can you remove all traumas from yourself, or is there always going to be work to do, inner exploring?
Well, what can happen if you work systematically, you might very likely clear the traumas from your individual life, but then the process then tends to move into the transpersonal realm, and there's going to be you can be confronting the pain of the world, the pain of humanity, and so on, which goes way beyond whatever you experience in this incarnation. I think I mentioned also about my own sessions that when I was still in Prague, you know, a lot of my sessions were perinatal in the 60s, 70s, and so on. Then later, when I came to the United States, there was really no personal material, but where I would experience in the past something like an episode of toxicity inside of my mother's womb. In these more advanced sessions, I would be dealing with the pollution of the planet. I would experience what fish experience somewhere in Elbe, when it gets all the fallout of the German industry and so on. What we are doing to life on this planet, and, dealing with the problems that we have, the obstacles in creating really planetary civilization, and get over the tribalism that we have, and the religious wars and all that nonsense. So we would still be dealing with problems on a much larger scale. Chris Beige, who wrote a very interesting book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, when he talks about the fact that when we do the work, for example, with psychedelics, when we get to the perinatal level, when we are dealing with our own birth memory, that it tends to also open up into scenes from human history, all kinds of wars and revolutions and genocide and so on. And his idea about it was that at that point, it becomes like a process of cleaning the field of consciousness of humanity. If you imagine how horrible the human history was, how many atrocities, how many wars and revolutions were happening, so that somehow some of it stayed in the field of consciousness, including a kind of a karmic field. So then he believed that when we do this work, that we at a certain point we get beyond our individual issues, and we are actually cleansing the field of consciousness of the human species, sort of working towards a better future. So, this is a theory. I'm not saying this is the way it is, but I think it's an interesting idea. So thank you very much, and we'll connect again next Tuesday.
Yes, thank you very much, Stan. And we'll say goodbye to everyone, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place, and we'll be delighted to see you then. So enjoy your week, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.